Hey guys, Jameson Redding here with the Road Trip Angler, and I wanted to share a quick tip with you today on what a wacky rig is, how to rig it, and when to use it. To start with, wacky rigging basically means that you're hooking a soft plastic through the center, which is going to give it kind of a unique presentation. Most other rigs like the Texas rig or Carolina rig are going to end up pinning the bait through the end on one end or the other, but this way you're going to get action from both ends of the bait by rigging it directly in the center of the bait. This presentation is most commonly done with a stick bait or a stick worm, which is something like the Gary Yamamoto Cinco, or here I have the Z-Man sinkers. These baits naturally sink at a very slow rate, so that gives you a very natural presentation. Other things can be used like creature baits that imitate crawfish, or just other types of worms, but usually in that 4 to 6 inch range, in a type of stick worm like I have here is what people typically use. And there are also some other things I'm going to show you that may help you rig this up easier and increase that hookup ratio. You can really use a lot of different hook types for this presentation, including even a worm hook. However, I have found over the years that I really prefer a drop shot style hook, either in the weedless presentation or here's just the bare hook. These are called drop shot hooks because they're commonly used in that presentation, but we're talking about wacky rigged, and the reason I choose these style hooks is because they have a little bit more of an elbow here at the bottom, and I also use what's called a wacky O-ring tool or an O-wacky tool, and these can be picked up usually at most tackle shops. But what this allows you to do is place an O-ring onto the bait, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. The reason for placing that O-ring on the bait is it's going to just allow more hook to be exposed. It's also going to allow the plastic to last a bit longer, I find. If you do put the hook through the plastic, it can tend to break there or stretch or pull out when a fish grabs this bait and you go to set the hook. They don't always inhale the entire bait, and this presentation is notorious for having small fish grab at either end of the bait and not get the entire hook. So it's gonna increase your chances on catching a lot of fish. But now I wanna show you how to rig this presentation. And this is probably my favorite way to do a wacky style or wacky rig. And you may find that other things work better for you, but this is the way I like to set up a wacky rig. To start with, I'm gonna take my stick bait. In this case, it is a Sinkers from Z-Man. And I'm gonna use the O-ring tool. So you just slide, with this tool, you just slide in the middle here about halfway, and then I'm gonna work this O-ring all the way down and onto the bait. If you don't have it perfectly centered, it really doesn't matter. In a pinch, I will take just the regular drop shot hook, go under the O-ring, and that is it. You can see there that that O-ring will sit kind of right in that elbow of the hook, and when this is falling through the water, it will spread out and just kind of have that wobble effect, which is a very natural presentation. Now I'll show you how to do this without an O-ring as well. And that was a weightless presentation, meaning that the bait itself is going to sink, and I did not add any kind of extra weight to the bait. But in some situations, you may want the bait to sink a bit faster. In the case of the Z-Man lures, even though they have salt and will sink, eventually they may actually become buoyant because the Z-Man plastic is very buoyant and will float. So if you need it to sink a little bit faster, you can use a weighted version of that same drop shot style hook or wacky style hook. This is the VMC Wacky Jig. I'm not partnered with any of these brands. Z-Man does send me these plastics, and I really appreciate it, and that's why I'm using them to demonstrate this, because it is what I personally use a lot of the time. But a lot of companies make great product and great hooks, so I picked these up simply because they were what was available. They're a wacky designed hook for wacky rigging, and they have a little bit of weight, so that's going to help my bait sink a little bit quicker. It's only a 1/16 of an ounce, and you could still use the O-ring here, but you're just going to simply go through the plastic in this case if you don't have the O-ring. And then when this falls, it will tend to sink with the weight down and still give you that natural presentation where you have movement from both sides of the worm or soft plastic. Now let's talk about when to use this presentation. I will pull out the wacky rig when I'm having a tough day on the water. If I can't get a bite on a moving bait, which is how I like to fish, usually the wacky rig is kind of my backup or go-to plan. The one thing about it is it does attract all types of fish and all size fish. So a lot of times you are going to catch a lot more smaller fish and not necessarily just target larger fish, but it doesn't keep larger fish from biting it. And when you need a bite, it can be a great presentation. The way I fish this presentation is typically in a river or in a lake, around structure, or even in deeper water where I know fish are holding. In a river, it may be in an eddy or right up against the bank where you might have an undercut with that current. It is a do nothing presentation. I literally cast this out. I let it sink on its own. I keep a little bit of line tension so that I can feel the bite, because typically it is a very subtle bite and you might miss it if you're not paying close attention. And if you have too much line out, it tends to get swallowed by fish. They will take it all the way down, and if you don't feel that bite and get that hook set kind of immediately, you may end up killing a fish, so you do want to be careful with that. But honestly, I don't jig this bait, I don't move it, I let it do its natural thing, which is sink and fall slowly, or in current, kind of move with the current. And if I don't get a bite or have a nibble in a few seconds, I will typically pull it and cast to another location or move it. Now in a lake situation, you might want to leave it longer, but in a river situation where you have current, once you know it's kind of went through that zone that should be holding fish, you can go ahead and reel it in and put it back out there. I usually rig this with fluorocarbon because number one, fluorocarbon naturally sinks. And number two, it is a do nothing presentation, so fish have time to swim up to it, look at it, study it, and check it out. And I've actually seen fish do that, and therefore I want a very clear line that they can't see. So I typically will rig it on Seaguar Gold Label or something like that to make sure that they can't see it. And I will use as light of line as I feel comfortable with getting away with. If I'm fishing around heavier cover, I may increase the line in weight class up to say 20 pounds, but most of the time I'm going with a 10, 15, or even less than that pound test line. That is the Wacky Rig, how I typically rig it and when and where I typically fish it. Don't be afraid to play around with different hook styles and different types of baits. And most commonly used is that stick worm, but a lot of people will use creature baits, and you can even do this with jerk shads and things like that. Flukes, jerk shads, different kinds of worms. But you may have to play around a little bit to see what works for you and give it a try. Hopefully this helps you catch more fish when you're out on the water. And for more tips and tricks like this, be sure to subscribe to the Road Trip Angler. And as always, thanks for watching. Road Trip Angler would like to thank our global partners for helping support the mission to get people outside and on the water.